Right now, we know the legislature is back in session, and there are protesters gathering around the House of Assembly this hour, the People's House, as it's known. And when it comes to what is going on inside the ledge, what's happening inside the offices of the MLAs, thought we'd get some interesting perspective from a man who just got his wallet back. Andrew Younger is here with us. We don't want to go into too much detail, but your wallet went missing and it showed up at your house again.
Yeah, it did. It was pretty funny. I went out to get the mail, and there it was in a bag hanging on the bottom of the porch. So, whoever brought it back, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And everything was in it.
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, I can never remember what I had in my wallet, but all the important things were in it.
Now, you're waiting for duplicates of everything. That's not fun.
Yeah, well, that's all right. I'm happy it came back. I'd love to know the story. I wish they'd knocked on the door or something, but that's okay.
902-405-6000 if you know. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening today. The Premier yesterday was, somewhat conciliatory about his conversation with Liette Doucette, neither of whom really discussing what was discussed. There is this massive protest that's scheduled for later this afternoon. It's planned as a massive protest in numbers, not sure what we'll see. And if you're the Premier, Andrew, what do you think is going on in government's discussions behind the doors?
Well, I think people have read way too much into what the Premier said, because he just said that he wasn't going to introduce the legislation on day one. There was never really a firm commitment that it was going to be introduced on day one anyhow. I mean, we didn't really know when that might come. And there was some hints that there might be multiple pieces of legislation. So now they might just move it all into one piece of legislation and do it as a big piece. The other thing is he talked about compromise, but later on in the evening on one of the television networks, he seemed to back off that a bit.
Yeah, and I heard that. I didn't see the interview. I was at
I didn't either, but I've seen a transcript of it, and then I went back and looked at his remarks in the afternoon, and I think people read a bit too much into it, because my reading of it is he was saying he's willing to hear where the NSTU might be willing to compromise and might consider that. But he seemed pretty firm that he was still bringing in the changes. Maybe you see some tweaking around the edges, but that's about it.
We've got Andrew Younger in our studio. He's currently writing a book about his experiences. He's working on, is it a documentary, a TV series about the dogs?
Oh, yeah. Paul Kimball and I have a little fun project about documentary on dogs, which of course means that every time you try and get the last edits that come back or whatever on a book, everything delays things. I have a number of projects actually underway at the moment, but
any idea when the book may be ready for?
Yeah, well, hopefully the intent was this spring, and you keep trying to add things in, and I got to stop doing that.
I'm sure your editor's probably saying the same.
Well, that's the problem. I tell you what happens is it was all done last year, and then the whole teachers mess sort of blew up then, and then it was like, well, you can't really not include that, and we filed a lot of FOIPOPs and so forth with Freedom of Information requests just to get information, so that it wasn't. There was plenty of information in the book that was sort of backed up by government documents, and so that took some time.
With Andrew Younger in our studio, with an MLA, and we hear, this is back to work, but constituency work is exactly that. And I know Graham Steele talked a bit about, in his two books, about what his experience was. People don't perhaps underestimate how much is going on when you're not in session. Yeah,
well, they do, but also, especially the way things are at the moment, the legislature is at some level a waste of time. I mean, question period is a show for the cameras to get a soundbite. The media, no offense, but the media generally doesn't cover much of the goings on outside of question period. So that's when everybody tries to get something. Then it's just a fight over dueling press releases and now Twitter feeds. In the case of a majority government, the only drama that will be this time is they're so close to being not a majority government, is that if somebody doesn't show up for a crucial vote. But,
well, a nasty flu bug could really cause some...
Exactly. But, I mean, they have control of the timing of the votes, too. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the government decides what they're going to do, and very little changes. Most of the way that legislation is done now is it's all put in regulation, which means cabinet makes the decisions. So backbenchers have no power. Opposition members have very little power.
We've been working at trying to do a follow-up to a story I looked into a couple of years ago. In fact, it resurfaced with a woman saying her 16-year-old daughter was with her 18-year-old boyfriend who was going to get a tattoo. The 16-year-old ended up with a tattoo. And people are saying, aren't there rules, aren't there laws, aren't there regulations? It's been 6 years since a piece of legislation was introduced about piercings and tattoos. Yep. And it's never been put into practice. The regulations have never been adopted. So even this show that you're describing doesn't always end up with action.
No, and that's the thing, is that there's lots of pieces of legislation that are passed, but you can actually, the province actually has a website that tells you which ones haven't been proclaimed. I can't think of what the website address is off the top of my head, but it's Google. Pretty easy to find. And the reality is there's all kinds of bills that they pass and then they go, maybe we're not going to do that after all. Or they pass for optics, the fracking bill, which was moving along, and then it kind of just went by the wayside because by not releasing regulations, they don't have to answer them. But that also means it's not proclaimed. The tattoo one is the same one. And the tattoo one's a real shame because the tattoo was a public health one. It had the support of the industry and so forth. The big thing in this session, well, I guess there's going to be two big things. It'll be the budget and the teachers. But this is also a very early session for the Nova Scotia Legislature. It's very rare for them to go in before March break.
What do you make of that? Some are suggesting it's because of the busy agenda. We had a really truncated session last year before the election.
I think something's up. So, I mean, this is my conspiracy hat on for a second, is that the teachers thing doesn't really matter time-wise. I mean, you need they're taking a risk, right? Because they are required by provincial regulations to break for March break and to break at Easter. Those are two periods of time opposition MLAs can run back to their ridings and rile people about stuff that's been introduced or about the budget. They will need 2.5 weeks-ish to do the budget. They always introduce other legislation at the same time. The teachers' bill could easily wind its way through. The only one that really has any particular timelines attached to it that are coming up close would be the stuff around marijuana. But now, even that, we know that because it can't get through the Senate, is going to be into August, September, October. And it's NSLC. So NSLC knows what the rules are going to be. They've been told and probably involved in the legislation. And this isn't like a bunch of private businesses need to go out and get insurance or something. It makes me wonder whether there is another bill coming down the pipe, or alternatively, a report or issue coming out in late April or early May that perhaps they want to make sure that they're out of the legislature before that report comes out. And I think you'd have to look at things like the Auditor General's schedule and things. And
pull that together. We've got Andrew Younger in our studio who for many years was a politician. You've given that up. You've been outside of that political realm. You decided not to re-offer as an independent. We're here in the studio. One of the questions that came up with our Power Lunch discussion, that some reports are tabled and acted on. The Avis Glazed one, for example, almost in its entirety and almost immediately. In fact, it was tabled at the end of December of last year. We didn't get to see it until government had her release it, and then the next day said we're adopting all of the recommendations, 11 of the 22 right away. So I'm wondering, when it comes to these reports that are commissioned, these reports that are done, there was one on mental health that was never ever released publicly, and I'm curious as to who decides that. Is it?
Well, it's a cabinet decision. I mean, it's the minister's decision, but really it's the cabinet and the premier. My feeling, and this is what I did with the fracking report at the time, is that with very few exceptions, as soon as government gets the reports, they should release them, and they should say, listen, we're getting it the same time you are, so we don't have any comment on the moment, but feel free to send us your comments, and then give the opportunity for the public to give feedback. And I think they should have done that with the Glaze report. And outside of the issues of whether you agree with the individual recommendations in the report, the public really never got a chance to have their say on this issue. We only just came out of an election, so this is a major change that was not in the platform. There's also no reason it couldn't have been in the platform because McNeil and the people around him...
This was telegraphed.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, McNeil and the people around him have wanted to get rid of school boards for a long time, and they made it pretty clear last year they wanted the vice principals and principals in a different union. And, there are people going to argue till the cows come home about whether those are the right things to do or not, but they could have easily put those in their platform last year. I mean, it's not like we're in the third year of a mandate, but they didn't. So the only way to give people time to comment is to just they could have put the report out at Christmas, given people a couple of months to comment, come back. They probably still would have done what they wanted to do, but now they're also fighting a public relations battle that they didn't even allow people to comment.
We've got Andrew Younger in our studio. We're going to take our break. When we get back, we're going to continue the conversation about what's going on as this fall sitting of the legislature is getting underway right now. And we'll be back with more of our conversation with him after this. All right, it is our talk show on the News 95.7 frequency here on News 95.7 in Halifax. It's the 27th of February. The legislature is back in session today. We've got Andrew Younger in our studio, a man who spent a good deal of his life inside of that process. Andrew, why isn't there a throne speech today?
So they only need to have a throne speech right after an election, the first sitting. That starts a new session. Beyond that, you don't need one. And the only time you ever see one after that, before another election, is when it's a political document to use it as a communications tool. And
we saw federally prorogation of Parliament, and then you come back with a throne speech.
And you have to have a prorogation of the legislature in order to have because
you have to officially end the session.
Yeah, you do. Okay. And so often what they'll do is they'll have a session in the morning for 20 minutes, end the session, and then come back in the afternoon and start a new session. But if you see that done, and you will see that done, you often see it done the year before an election. That's just a political communications tool, right. A very expensive communications tool. But
we have obviously several pieces of legislation. We've talked a bit about the reports that come forward and government makes action on. But it requires legislation. If school boards are eliminated, if that's the end game, which it sounds like through the recommendation of
that's going to happen.
That's what government will do. But the rest of it, who opens schools, who closes schools?
Well, the one reason why governments of all stripes have never got rid of school boards is because they always like to be able to blame the school boards when there was an issue at a school, or they didn't ask to get renovations done, or didn't ask to build a school, or when schools were closed for snow. Mm-hmm. The minister is now ultimately responsible for all those things. So school closures, snow days, even the scheduling of a PD days. Welcome to the new question period.
The new question period. I'll be very interested to see how Carla McFarlane handles herself as the interim leader. She'll be the lead of the official opposition in that process.
I think Carla will do good. What's interesting to me is that when you look at the leadership candidates, Carla is very much on the left of the Conservative Party. But for the most part, those running for the leadership are on the right side of the party. And I actually tend to think Carla would, and I don't think she had any interest in running for the leadership, but I actually think she might have appealed more broadly across the province, because my sense is that some of the people running are sort of polarizing in certain areas because they are targeting certain demographics.
If you're the NDP with now a leader in the House, not outside of the House, I'm seeing a plethora of news releases. The party is trying to get the attention of the media to know that they're invested and involved.
They're still relevant.
And they're still relevant. But as the third party in the House, what really is accomplished by...
So they have a problem, and the problem they have is, so they have moved back to their traditional left side, which is fine, and that's an important part in the political spectrum. But obviously that is a smaller base of people. And there's a lot of people that go, yeah, I really like those ideas, but we're not going to do them, so they won't vote for them. They become more of an advocacy party. Where their challenge is so traditionally they stand up with unions. They're out there standing up with the NSTU, but the Conservatives are out there doing the same thing. And so they're, in some of these issues, they're being outflanked by the Conservative Party on the left. It's very strange. And the Liberals have moved very heavily to a very, very conservative right. Not even sort of a liberal right, but almost dare I say it, in some respects, almost like a Harper-like right, which is very
blue grit.
Yeah, really. Well, I mean, we used to say there's blue liberals and sort of orange liberals, but I mean, this is some of these issues have been a very hard turn to the right for sure.
Time and again, someone will stand up, someone will speak out and say we need to have more civility in the House. That even in the face of the Me Too movement, there have been stories told about politicians in that environment. What does this do to a slim majority government heading into the House? Does Stephen McNeil have to temper his tone?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's personalities too. I mean, first of all, everybody gets a bit heated in the legislature and says stupid things. I've done it. Other people have done it. There's few people in the legislature that haven't, but the legislature is an awful place. Like it's you go into question period, and I cringe when students come in from schools because it is yelling at each other and who can throw the most subtle insult that can get around the rules. I mean, years ago we heard about some really nasty, famous fights in the legislature, physical fights. But even during the time I was there, I mean, you saw the altercation between Keith Caldwell and the former minister of Percy Paris. But then I've seen other altercations like that over the years in the back halls where people push people or are yelling at you. I mean, and that's not good. It's not a great environment in that respect. I don't know how we move past that, but it is also an environment that feeds and thrives on rumor and gossip and hearing something negative or disparaging about somebody that you're against. It's amazing. It's like a really bad high school
with
in
alcohol,
a lot of respects.
Or more alcohol. You also spent some time in City Hall. You were an elected councillor. We've had this conversation today about whether or not public complaints against public officials need to be aired in the public. In-camera session today, there was a vote. One councillor who had said he wanted his heard in public. That was the name used. They disagreed, so the whole matter went back in camera. Is that the wrong move, Andrew?
Yeah, it's the wrong move. I think Matt was right on this. I assume it was him that asked for it to be done because he talked about it. I think it should be in public. And one of the reasons, I mean, there's going to be certain exceptions where it can't be in public, but I mean, the kind of complaints we're talking about here, we need to see what the complaints are. We need to see, more importantly, how the councillor responds to them. And even more important than the councillor in question is how their colleagues respond to them. Instead, we don't know that in-camera session doesn't just become a debate over how do we make this go away. We don't know. And so I do think we need to councillors very few councillors have spoken out about these issues one way or the other. They say they're going to have their say at the session, and we don't get to see that session.
And we have no way to judge it. Ultimately, the ultimate judgment is on the election day for the...
Well, sure. I mean, there's no way, for stuff that we're talking about here, there's no way to get rid of a councillor, and there probably shouldn't be for stuff like this, because we don't want to start squelching opinions, even
ones you don't agree with.
Distasteful ones. Yeah. But the issue here is that, I mean, in the case, and I don't want to pick on Matt necessarily, but in the case of Matt, his constituents will decide whether they agree with that he is representing them fairly, and they might very well decide that that's the representation they want. Historically, there have been councillors who everybody went, oh my God, they're never going to get elected, and they get elected by huge margins because they represent their community well.
It's a fascinating peek behind the curtain in many ways. Andrew Younger, thank you so much. Can't wait for the book to come out. I know it's sooner rather than later, but we'll wait to hear that official word.
Yeah, I can't wait either.
All right, thanks for coming in. We'll step aside for a few seconds when we're back after the news. We're going to hear from the captain of Blue Nose 2, Phil Watson, who was named... he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award. He said, that doesn't mean they want me to retire. We'll talk about that when we get back after this. All right. Dan, I'm sorry. Dan wanted me to ask Andrew if there's any way to get politicians to be honest with constituents instead of towing party lines. I had an email yesterday from someone who said, and I should dig it up before I try and quote it, essentially it was from another member of the Legislative Assembly, it was from a member of the House of Commons who had said that there was a vote in the House over what government said about veterans, and he said, can't understand how this happens. Well, pretty easy. It's called a majority government and whipped party vote. Not one single Liberal MP voted against that government and that conversation. That said, I don't know if I would be ever able to explain how that happens. And I did miss that opportunity. Thanks, Dan. Oh, and another message we had from someone who said, Colin, who sent a note along to us here this afternoon. He said, here's what I like about Andrew Younger. He went through a scandal, got railroaded by the McNeil government, and came out the other side better than ever. I respect his voice and opinion on all topics and look forward to his future projects. Keep up the good work. Thanks.